going to have Tim Kulchyski from Cowichan Tribe speak first, and then Dave, and then Elizabeth and I will do a presentation. We're going to speak about 20 minutes each, and then have 5 minutes or so after each presenter for questions, and then we'll also hopefully have a bit of chunk of time at the end to, you know, have some additional questions or comments. So that's the plan of the evening, and we're just, again, thank you so much for being here, and we just want to jump right into to our first guest speaker, Tim Kulchyski works for Cowichan Tribes as a biologist, and I'm just going to let him speak for himself around to introduce himself in the best way, because I just want to listen to him speak. So thank you, Tim, for being here.
Is here okay, or do I need?
Actually, if you could stand within the frame of, and we can turn this off here, actually, because you're not using the slides, right? And yeah, anywhere between the screen and the podium and close to the microphone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, hi, Tapka, Somenos and hi, Tapka, Somenos and Kw'amutsun. It's an email at Alchemia, I Kw'amutsun. And the at Kulchysk. My Schwatlaka is from Kw'amutsun. As my Schwampnik mentioned, it is important for us, especially when we are at home, or even if we're visiting other communities, it's really important for us to use the Halkami'num language, to use our language. There are a broad range of teachings that we do our best to try and respect. My Schwampnik, I'm really glad and I'm really proud of my Schwampnik. He follows not one or two, many of those teachings. And he really is like our families of yesteryear. He carries on that tradition where we traveled. And we traveled. Somebody's going to throw cookies, I think, to try and keep me on time. Elizabeth? As I mentioned, my grandparents are late Simon and late Violet Charlie. My traditional Cowichan name is Kulchysk. Our family is from Quamichan, actually, and Lakes. To give you an example, I'll talk a little bit about family and people and community so that it'll help relate the significance of S-amuna and Kw'amutsun. I'm a biologist for Cowichan Tribes. I sit on the watershed board. As many of you know, I wear many different hats, so many hats that I gave up and I can't keep track anymore. But I think the important thing for me as I go through, no matter what job I'm in or what aspect I'm looking at, what really grounds me is the experiences I had growing up, sitting with my great-grandparents, sitting with my grandparents, working in community, and then having the opportunity to sit with a variety of elders. And all of those elders, if you take the time, I want to thank everybody here for taking the time to listen, taking the time to share. If you take the time, it is astounding how quickly this network that we have here in the valley stretches around the globe. I do really raise my hands to my Schwampnik because, yeah, in an odd way, I guess in many respects, I kind of learned things the backward way, in too many ways, I guess, or the hard way. But many of my elders, like my Stopmuk, my great-grandfather, Butch, Angus Smith. He related, when I traveled overseas to the South Pacific, I came back, and the first comment was, "Oh, hey, Somenos." That's the reference for grandson. He says, asked how I was, and he asked if I ran into family. And I explained to him, I said, well, no, I was in the South Pacific, long ways away on the other side of the planet. And he asked again. So I really know, you know, like by Australia, like way over on the other side, like way, way, way over. And then you go way, way over. And he kind of looked at me and he said, yeah, did you run into family? And I just didn't know what to say. So he sat me down and he proceeded to tell me the story of prior to settlement, prior to any real colonial events here in the valley, the fur trade here on the coast had been going for some time, right? So sea otters, as an example, had already been wiped out once by Russian trade that came in through Alaska, quite a while prior to a lot of the major developments. And so a part of the whole battle and a part of what we miss during our sort of modern perspectives on history looking back are all of those other kind of more complicated or convoluted relationships. So after the sea otters were wiped out, started to focus on mammals. Now, what I kind of missed, same as the cowboy era here in the province, all of the first cowboys here in BC were First Nations. Who were the only people that knew how to get up the Fraser River with no roads? Likely, in some events, no canoes in the middle of the winter, or at crazy times when people were goofy enough to think that they could go up to Boston Bar in a couple of days with no transportation whatsoever, with no know-how, no ability to survive the winter just coming up from California. They were all First Nations. And they had the horses. My great-great-grandparents had more horses than anybody else here in the valley. He reiterated that in that era, First Nations really were the only people you could take on with real maritime knowledge. So the ability to travel in the open ocean, and I'm a marine biologist. I have worked on boats all my life. Yeah, I don't know if anything has felt so weird as being on the W.E. Ricker, a big Coast Guard ship that's 200 feet long, out 25 miles out to sea, and every few minutes I've got to look up and see, geez, I can't see land anymore, you know? It's just a kind of a weird feeling. You get used to the things that you get used to. And if you're used to the open ocean, you're okay to travel months at a time. So one vessel traveled down to the tip of South America, sealing. They got hit by a big storm and ended up getting pushed across over towards Australia. They got hit by another storm, and then they shipwrecked. Another thing I didn't know was at the time, there was actually a fairly decent network, although it ridiculously slow by modern standards, the ability to transport mail. So if you could make it to a specific locale, could be a crevice, could be an old stump with a hole in it, could be a post, there was a place where you could get a message out. So lo and behold, a message came back, and it reiterated that family over there had been shipwrecked, and that they were okay, and they would make their way back. So my stomach was really asking, did you run into any of our descendants from those families? So having traveled over there, yeah, I know they probably didn't really try all that hard to come back after seeing the richness and the resources there in the South Pacific. What we miss today, and I think one of the toughest things to relate, is one. It's something I can't distinctly relate. My uncle can do his best to relate. It's the richness and the incredible properties that the valley held. My uncle, one of our elders, relates his first-hand experience from traveling from Quamichan. So Somenos Creek used to actually enter the Cowichan River below Quamichan. That system has changed. What we miss today, even the people here now, are the significant changes that have happened to this system. The changing of the river, the fixing of the path of the river. All of these problems or issues that we constrain the current systems under. One of our elders left from Quamichan, paddled down the Cowichan River, and he was impressed with the fact that his canoe would shake from all of the Chinook that were returning. So as he went down the river, Chinook, as they tend to kind of school and fin, there were so many fish that they could not help but actually hit the canoe. I've fished all my life. I was as young as my daughter, so I was probably 7 or 8 when I started to try and fish, and would carry my brother's spear for him, traveling this deep in the water in the middle of the winter. Those kinds of things have an impact in the way you relate to the land around you in the middle of the winter. That elder traveled out into the bay, and the same thing, all the way out into the bay. His canoe was shaken the whole way out. He traveled all the way around Sansom Point and up Sansom Narrows. Same thing all the way out Sansom Narrows. He went out past Tent Island, past Cooper Island, past the little islands above Panup, the northern end of Salt Spring, and out to Pullier Pass. Long story short, the entire way he was running into Chinook. So he traveled up to the beach to visit his stopmok, his great-grandfather. Very unaccustomed to what you would do, he ditches his canoe on the beach, throws his paddle down, and goes running up the beach. So that one of the interesting parts is, yeah, he was 9, maybe 10, and he paddled from here out to Pullier Pass. My oldest is 10, and I think, wow, yeah, I don't even let him walk to town. Like, but he went out to Pullier Pass, visited his grandfather, and he goes running up the beach, and he's all excited. And he relates all of what he saw. He relates all the Chinook, and he's just excited, saying, wow, you know, there are so many Chinook. He was just happy. And his stopmok shakes his head and looks down. Now, I've seen that look, so I know what it represents from our elders. It was a look of utter sadness and almost despair, because he looks down and he shakes his head. And he literally said, "You should have seen what it used to look like, grandson." Now, for me, that I cannot fathom that. We're finally getting some returns coming back at 14,000, 14,500, over 10,000 the last couple of years. We've finally turned that tide. In 1906, we had leadership from all of the Salishan communities, traveled to England, went to the Royal Palace to petition the palace. So the king wasn't there. I don't know if that was convenience or not, but they made it into the palace. They made their presentation. And a part of what they were bringing forward was the damming practices up at the lake, where they would pile huge old growth logs. I was trying to think, I have to admit, yeah, there are some aspects, I'm really, really old. My Schwamnik was talking in meters. I was trying to figure out, well, how long is that in canoe length? What was related to me is that you wanted a large ocean-going canoe. They're 60 to 70 feet long and can be 12 to 14 feet wide. Those were the people carriers, the cargo carriers, the open water canoes. They succeeded in stopping the practices, but the result, one of the results, basically was wiping out early run Chinook. So thanks to the knowledge our elders had, we've pushed the last couple of decades to try and get some half-decent numbers around early run Chinook. Because there were none. DFO's idea is, well, they're extinct. There are so few fish, they're not worth counting. I said, well, if there's a run there now, and they were considered extinct in 1937, and there are still, we still have fishers telling us they're seeing fish. In fact, we've had people who've eaten them, much to my chagrin, especially because they didn't take a sample. But, so we pushed. We've been enumerating them. Maybe down to a couple dozen, or maybe as many as a couple hundred. We've had a count of a couple hundred. They're still there. That was the big run. The run that's now down up to presumably 14,000 fish, that's the fall run. That's the small run. So why is that important, and how does that relate to Somenos and Quamichan? Well, the village here was the true Somenos village. So with the advent of, well, the huge population crash for one, Somenos village stretched from here to the river where the current band office is at the Allenby Road Bridge. That was Somenos village. Quamichan village, if anybody knows the big oak tree that fell during the windstorm, Quamichan village stretched from there all the way down, and there were longhouses the entire way. Conservatively, today at 5,000, we're supposed to be the biggest band in BC. Presumably at 5,000, we're maybe a quarter of the population we were somewhere around the time of contact. So these systems here, in fact, in the reports from Brian Tuddy, the guy who became area director for South Coast Fisheries and Oceans, relayed how important these systems were in his time. Richards Creek, Bings Creek, Aval Creek, absolutely chocked full of coal. So while we were trying to get some numbers, or get current numbers for Richards Creek, in which we were happy to see literally a handful of fish, we ran into an elder there, a farmer who'd lived there for a couple of generations. And he relayed numbers well into, what he relayed were numbers into the thousands. 5,000 or more, he said, maybe even 10, for that tiny little system. And so, it's hard to equate to that. People often ask, why the ocean's full of fish, you guys keep saying there are fish everywhere. Why would you care about these tiny little systems? Well, for those of you who may have grown up eating potatoes and turnips or oatmeal or things that you had every single day, yeah, you know, the reason why there's a spice trade and why pepper and salt and all of these things became important is because day after day, you kind of want a little bit of variety. I have seen it where kids eat salmon on a regular basis and they're like, do I have to eat salmon? That sounds a bit strange today, but that was one of our main protein resources a short time ago. So places like Somenos, places like Shaw Creek, they were absolutely crucial to sustaining a large population and sustaining them over a long period of time. So today we have these weird events where the river comes up so quickly, the Chinook basically pass their way through. We have a nice clear river. When it comes up quite quick, we have weirs and we have spearing, dip netting. It's a heck of a lot more productive to come up during high flow events, especially during the winter when coho will be coming through. Today, we're lucky if we get a couple of runs. Years ago, there would be a huge number of consecutive runs entering all of the little systems. And if you know fish, sockeye is incredibly rich. That's why we can it. That's why it tastes great, even when you can it. Smoked fish. If you try and smoke something that is incredibly rich, you have to worry about how well it's preserved. So we would smoke fish and hang. One family might hang 300 fish. It's not all for that one family. If you have bounty, if you are smart, and if you're willing to work, you look forward. If there's an event, a family has a loss, or a family needs help, you have your stores, and you share them. If you share them, part of one of the terms we often use is motlet. Motlet literally means getting even. That could be good, that could be bad. Somebody could do you harm, and you're like, I'm going to remember that. Or, in truth, what it really means is reciprocity. So, if you, and it's very true, Lachlan, the community just above Prince Rupert, has an area that they reference that is set aside for Cowichan. Down in California, my late grandfather was down there for about 15 minutes, and he ran into family down there. He knew, growing up, losing his mom at 3, growing up with his grandparents, he knew that older history. He knew the names. That's why the names and the history and the place names and those connections become so important, because it weaves a network over the landscape so that when you come up, even if you've never been to Somenos village, you know where to go to find Richards Creek. You know where to go to find Bings Creek. And all of those things are built in. If you're talking about smoking fish and the huge importance of species like coho, if you smoke them after they've gone through the system and they're farther up, closer to spawning, they lose that richness. You might think, okay, well, why would you want that? It probably wouldn't taste as good. Yeah, you might argue that they don't necessarily taste the same, but if you're smoking fish and you're hanging it in the rafters in a province that arguably is a little bit wet in the winter, it's smart to prepare your fish properly and ensure there's nothing that will turn or putrefy or get moldy. And if that fish, that's your store, so that's your winter supply. Really, in yesteryear, that will save your life. And so in yesteryear, there were all kinds of activities. My great-grandparents that lived in Quamichan, they were as Quamichan as it gets. That's their Schwatmet. That's the place that they belong. That's their origin. They were there 2 months of the year. Even into their 90s, they were traveling the territory up north of the island, up to Rivers Inlet, up past, down south into the US and down into California. But just wanted to share those little bits. It's not just coho, it's trout and all kinds of other species. Dave's going to touch on that, and of course Dave's going to talk about the ogre part of the story on how poorly we've treated these systems that have basically fed our communities here for a multitude of millennia. And we know we can bring it back, but it just takes a little focus.
Thank you so much. So did we want to do a couple of questions for Tim now, or are people happy to wait until the end? Okay, maybe we'll wait until the end and just keep moving along. I'll get Dave's